This lesson is about the Jim Crow laws, which were in place in the United States of America from 1876 until its formal ending in 1964. Jim Crow laws were a collection of state and local statutes that legalized racial segregation. They were named after a black minstrel show character, Jim Crow, and the laws existed for about 100 years, from the post-Civil War era, so just after the US Civil War finished, until 1964, when they were formally ended. And I say formally ended because although this was legally and formally ended in 1964, a lot of the racial segregation really continued to take place in a bit more of a subversive way. The laws were meant to marginalise African Americans by denying them the right to vote, hold jobs, get an education or other opportunities. Those who attempted to defy Jim Crow laws often faced arrest, fines, jail sentences, violence, and in some cases death. Let's revisit what the term segregation means. So segregation is to separate something. So the basis for the Jim Crow laws was not to be racist, but to be separate but equal. And so this was seen as constitutional and was upheld by the Supreme Court until 1965. So the notion of separate but equal. So African American people can have the same rights as white American people, but they're just going to do it in another place. For example, schools in the South of America were definitely segregated and under this notion of separate but equal. So we're going to explore that a little bit further in this lesson. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 formally and legally ended segregation in public places and banned employment discrimination on the basis of race, colour, religion, sex, or national origin. And it was considered and still is considered one of the crowning legislative achievements of the civil rights movement. It was perpetuated by John F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr., but after Kennedy's assassination, it was signed off by the incoming president, Lyndon B. Johnson, in 1964. So what we're going to do now is look at some examples and discuss this separate but equal notion. And the question is, how did the Jim Crow laws discriminate against black people in the USA? So for each category, we've got school, travel, leisure, housing, and voting. You're going to take notes from the examples about how the Jim Crow laws, discriminated against African Americans in America. So first of all, voting, and can I just say you can pause at any time to take notes, obviously, it's a recording. So let's look at voting. When African American people went to vote, they had to pay a poll tax. Now, they were, in general, African Americans in the South of America were quite poor and they were unable to pay this tax, so they didn't go to vote. In America, voting is not compulsory, it's by choice. And so if you couldn't pay to put food on your table, you certainly wouldn't go and pay to vote. People in Australia go and vote because we have to, but a lot of them complain about it. But that's not the case in America. So there was a poll tax that many people couldn't afford. The other barrier to African American people voting was that the literacy around the voting was actually beyond what they had learnt in their own separate but equal African American school. Because their education wasn't at the same standard as white Americans, many African American people really couldn't understand how to vote, therefore they didn't turn up to vote. So if you are predominantly got white American voters, you will vote for white American people. There weren't many, there are a few exceptions. There weren't many African American candidates because African Americans just didn't turn up to vote. So really keeping the laws in the country quite white. And I just want to make the point too before we go on that a lot of this really happened in the South of America, in the southern states. A lot of the northern states were quite integrated and didn't use these Jim Crow laws to segregate African Americans. But definitely in the South of America, these laws were definitely upheld because it was really a way of separating African Americans from whites. And yes, they were incredibly racist. So the next category is schools. So white students and African American students attended different schools, and the US Supreme Court stated that as long as these schools were of equal quality, then this was quite lawful. So we're going to look now at these schools and compare the quality, separate but equal, of these schools. So this is a high school in Kansas for white children. White children only are allowed to attend this school. And this is a school for African American children. So you might want to pause here and go back and have another look, or you can look at the PowerPoint to make your notes. But what you should be noting down is the differences and maybe some inequalities and how the Jim Crow laws affected African Americans. And I would say the first thing is obviously the physical difference. So you can see there that the high school for white children has got amazing buildings, particularly this is in 1950s, fantastic facilities. It's quite large. It looks like a lot of money has been spent. If you just compare the physical building to the African American school physical buildings, made out of wood panels, probably not brand new, probably recycled wood, and there is one small building. So I would start off by comparing the physical, and then you can talk about maybe money that's spent, the number of teachers. So there'd be a lot of teachers in that white school compared to one teacher for the number of students here. And then maybe mention what education African Americans would get compared to white Americans, and if that is separate but equal. I'm not going to go into this much depth with every example, but I just wanted to sort of give you to get you on the right track. So here is an African American classroom. So that's inside a school. I don't have one of a white American classroom, but you can certainly Google it and see what it looked like and compare. And interestingly, this is taken in 1935, and it's children outside a segregated Mexican school, because it wasn't just African American people the Jim Crow laws extended to. It was basically anyone of a different race or color. So we're going to move into travel. African American people were not allowed to travel in the same carriages as white people. If they caught the bus, they had to get on the rear entrance to the bus, and they had to sit at the back of the bus. And there was a cordoned off section for African Americans. And you may discover in your studies, or if you'd like to research, Rosa Parks, very famous protest where she purposefully sat in the white section and encouraged people to do so. And there was a big protest around where you could sit on the bus. There was also separate waiting rooms. So we're going to look at some photos of examples here. You can see here, buying a ticket, you were physically separated and it was labelled white or coloured. Train station, so there's a coloured waiting room, and again the African American people would have to sit in their own carriage, and it would probably be at the back. And I would assume, well, I do know from my research that there would be no sort of air conditioning, it wouldn't be as clean, it would be overcrowded. Thinking about leisure, when you were dining out or going to the cinema or even going to the bathroom, it was all very separate. So let's have a look at some examples of that. So here we have a cafe, and you can see here there's a white entrance and a coloured entrance. Think about too what what consequences there would be for African American people if they walked through the white doorway. They wouldn't be served. That would be the minimum consequence, but there would be other consequences, and often it would end in violence. Here we have a drink dispensing machine. So we've got white customers only for the icy cold Coke. Here is a diner, which is, you can see white and coloured served here. Interesting. And a theatre just for coloured people. A billiard hall for coloured people. So white people wouldn't go there. There wasn't the same consequences for white people going to coloured facilities as the other way around. However, white people living in the South of America wouldn't go into coloured areas, and certainly wouldn't go into coloured billiard halls. If they did, it may be, fobbed off as an excuse to visit someone who was working for them, a domestic maybe. But also, if they did it regularly and they had African American friends, they would definitely be shunned from society, and possibly, again, there would be some violent actions against them. Here we have restrooms, as they call them in America, and there's a white and a coloured arrow, so you'd have to go to the separate restroom. And we've got an example here of drinking fountains, again, separate but equal. You can look at the difference between the white drinking fountain and the coloured fountain. So that next slide was just the writing folio question, and that is for the next lesson. But maybe we'll have a look at it at the end. So go through the examples again, make notes under each category of what differences do you see? How do these laws affect African Americans? So look at what's in the picture and say, you know, physically, how are they affected? Maybe psychologically, financially. You can go into any types of detail that you like there. So the next lesson you'll be doing a writing folio piece, and it is based on this lesson. And you'll write 200 words on the effects the Jim Crow laws would have had on Black people growing up in Southern America. So you can use all the information that you've just written, all the notes from this lesson, to add to that answer. And so I want you to think about in your answer the housing, the standard of living. What's it like to not be able to vote and have a political say in your country? What's it like to have to go to a school that you can see is physically inferior to your white neighbour? What psychological effect does it have growing up? What do you think? How do you think Black people perceive white people and vice versa? All of this information can go into your answer and all the notes that you took in this lesson. Of course, if you have any questions, you can ask me if I'm your teacher, or you can ask your teacher. There'll also be a PowerPoint for this video as well.